On a gray Sunday morning in 1943, a woman in a blue RAF uniform bent over two photographs of a field in France. To almost anyone else, the pictures showed nothing important. A few pale scratches, a strip of timber, a patch of disturbed earth. But when Constance Babington Smith slid the second photograph beneath the left lens of her stereoscope, the field changed shape. The flat print lifted. The scratches became ramps. The earthworks rose into shadow, and two strange curved buildings appeared beside them, like skis lying on their sides. They were not farm sheds. They were not storage huts. They were part of a German weapon site, aimed across the channel toward London. She reached for a chinograph pencil, circled the shapes, and picked up the telephone. That call did not end the war, but it changed the part of the war that had not yet begun, because the weapon those buildings were built to serve was designed to kill without a pilot, without a runway, and without warning. The British would come to call it the V1, a flying bomb, 7.9 meters long, a pulse jet engine on its back, an 850-kilogram warhead in its nose. Once it reached a launch site, it did not need an airfield. It did not need a trained bomber crew. It needed a steel ramp, a catapult, a small launch team, and a target bearing. And the target was London. By late 1943, British intelligence knew the Germans were building something dangerous. Pieces of the warning had arrived from different directions. A Danish engineer had passed information through contacts in Stockholm. Bletchley Park had decoded German references to a deliberately boring phrase, an anti-aircraft target device. RAF bombers had already struck Peenemünde, the Baltic Research Center where Germany's long-range weapons were being developed. But Peenemünde was only the laboratory. The real question was launch. Where would the weapons be fired from? That question landed inside a low brick building at RAF Medmenham, a requisitioned country house in Buckinghamshire, about 40 kilometers west of London. It was not a battlefield in the ordinary sense. There were no trenches there, no artillery batteries, no infantry pushing through mud. There were light tables, chemicals, rulers, pencils, maps, and rows of young women in RAF blue leaning over photographs until their eyes burned. The room smelled of developer fluid and hot lamps. On the tables sat stereoscopes, strange metal instruments that looked almost harmless, like opera glasses set on little legs. But in the hands of trained interpreters, they turned photographs into terrain. That was the hidden power of Medmenham. Two aircraft photographs of the same ground, taken seconds apart from slightly different angles, could be placed side by side. The left eye saw one, the right eye saw the other. And the brain did what it always does when given two views of the same world. It built depth. Flat roofs became measured structures. Bare dirt became raised earthworks. A shadow became evidence. A line in the soil became a ramp, and a ramp had direction. Direction mattered. A building could be disguised. A road could be curved through trees. A storage shed could be shaped to confuse the eye from above. But a launch ramp had to point where the weapon was meant to go. That was the mistake the Germans could not hide. The search had tightened after a French resistance source reported a construction site near Bois-Carré in the Pas-de-Calais. The report described a strange curved building, almost ski-shaped, so the interpreters were told what to hunt for. Not a city, not a factory, not a bunker, a pattern. Constance Babington Smith had been at her table since 7 in the morning on November 28, 1943. Before the war, she had written about aircraft. At Medmenham, that eye for machines had become an intelligence weapon. She examined frame after frame from a de Havilland Mosquito reconnaissance flight over northern France. More than 300 photographs. Most gave her nothing. Then Bois-Carré rose out of the print. There was a long, narrow ramp. There was a rectangular structure partly buried in earth. There were the curved storage buildings the resistance sketch had warned them about. In a single flat image, they could have passed as harmless marks. Through the stereoscope, they became intentional. And intention is what intelligence work looks for. Within 48 hours, the finding had reached the Crossbow Committee, the British body responsible for countering Germany's long-range weapons. The committee gave sites like this a name: ski sites. And once Medmenham knew what one looked like, the map began to fill. Through December, interpreters worked in rotating shifts. One analyst called out features, another marked overlays. New photographs came in, were developed, dried, carried to the tables, and placed under lenses. By December 20th, they had identified 95 ski sites across the Pas-de-Calais and the Cherbourg Peninsula. By the end of the month, the number had reached 103. Each site carried the same family resemblance: a launch ramp around 45 to 48 meters long, curved storage buildings, a structure thought to support compass calibration, a fueling point, access roads that tried not to look like access roads. The sites hid in woods and along hedgerows, where the single overhead view was weakest. But stereoscopy punished that kind of concealment. A roof had height, a berm had relief, a ramp had slope, a shadow had meaning. The Germans were not moving slowly. Under Organisation Todt supervision, tens of thousands of French laborers had been forced into construction work. Sites were built through autumn nights under electric floodlights, an unusual urgency that resistance observers noticed from the ground. German planning called for a large launch network to become operational before the end of 1943. Crossbow hit first. On December 5, 1943, the United States 8th Air Force launched a major attack against suspected flying bomb sites in the Pas-de-Calais. RAF Bomber Command followed. By the end of December, more than 700 bombing sorties had been flown against ski sites. But finding a target was not the same as destroying it. That was the brutal arithmetic of 1943. A heavy bomber crew flying from 6,000 meters could drop a great weight of explosives and still miss the small object that mattered. A ski site covered only a few hectares. A ramp might survive if the bombs landed hundreds of meters away. A storage building could be damaged, repaired, or rebuilt. Some sites had to be hit again and again before they were judged unusable. Medium bombers could be more precise against individual buildings, but they carried less explosive weight. The campaign was enormous, the target was small, and the clock was moving. Then the Germans changed the problem. By early 1944, engineers began abandoning the distinctive ski site design. Instead of large, permanent, curved buildings, they moved toward modified launch sites that used prefabricated equipment and very little above-ground structure. A full ski site could take weeks. A modified site could be assembled in days. Between launches, it could look like almost nothing: an empty clearing, a camouflaged strip, a field with the wrong shadow only visible from the right angle. For Medmenham, that meant the old pattern was no longer enough. They could not simply hunt for ski-shaped buildings. They had to hunt for intention itself. They photographed woodland after woodland within range of England, then examined the images for one hard requirement the Germans still could not escape. A ramp had to be pointed. The first V-1 attacks came on the night of June 12th to June 13th, 1944, 6 days after the Allied landings in Normandy. 10 flying bombs were fired. Several failed almost immediately. A few reached England. 6 people were killed in Kent. That was only the beginning. From June through September, thousands of V-1s were launched from northern France, later from modified sites in the Netherlands, and from aircraft over the North Sea. More than 9,000 were fired. More than 2,000 reached London. Over 6,000 people were killed. Nearly 18,000 were seriously injured. More than 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. These numbers are not a triumphal ending. They are the measure of what still got through. The V1 was terrifying because it made sound part of the weapon. Londoners heard the engine approaching, a harsh buzzing overhead. Then the engine stopped. And in that silence, people knew the bomb was falling. Nothing about Medmenham erased that terror. Nothing about Crossbow made London safe. But after the Allies overran the Pas-de-Calais later in 1944, intelligence teams walked through the sites that had once been only shadows on paper. They found wrecked ramps, abandoned buildings, German records, facilities that had never fired at all. The ground confirmed what the photographs had warned. Of the 103 ski sites identified by Medmenham in December 1943, 86 had been destroyed or damaged so badly that they were non-operational before the first V1 ever launched. The German shift to modified sites had not been a clever luxury. It had been forced, and those modified sites were less efficient than the original network. They were harder to prepare, more exposed to weather, and lacked the covered spaces needed for fast, repeated launches. Wing Commander Douglas Kendall later assessed that the destruction of the ski site network had delayed the V1 campaign by at least 6 months and reduced its operational intensity by about 70%. German planners had imagined launch rates that could climb into the thousands per day. The actual peak achieved from Northern Europe was closer to 97 per day. That difference was not abstract. It was days without sirens, streets not shattered, families not buried under brick dust, hospitals not filled, trains still running, fire crews not called to one more crater. The work at Medmenham did not look dramatic. No one there charged a position. No one saw the bomb fall. Most of their citations, when they came, had to stay vague because the work was classified. Constance Babington Smith received the MBE in 1945. She was also awarded the American Legion of Merit. After the war, she wrote one of the first major histories of Allied photographic reconnaissance, Evidence in Camera. But the deeper legacy was not one medal or one book. It was a new way of seeing war. Systematic overlapping photography, stereoscopic interpretation, rapid map overlays. Civilian-trained eyes turned into military intelligence, a method that would later feed into Cold War reconnaissance, high-altitude spy planes, and satellite imagery. Long before satellites could stare down at the Earth, women at Medmenham learned to read the height of a building from a shadow. They learned to see what camouflage tried to flatten. And on the morning after her first discovery, November 29, 1943, Babington Smith returned to the same table. A new stack of photographs waited. The rain moved across the Buckinghamshire fields outside. Inside, she placed another pair of images beneath the lenses. Before lunch, she found 3 more sites. No explosion marked the moment. No crowd understood what had happened. No siren sounded in London to thank her. Only a pencil circle and a print, a grid reference, an overlay passed to the duty officer. Then another photograph, and another. The V1 was built to turn distance into terror. Medmenham answered it with distance of another kind. A mosquito at altitude, a camera shutter, 2 photographs taken seconds apart, and a trained mind willing to stare until the Earth gave up its secret. The bomb was meant to announce itself only when its engine reached the sky over London. But months before that sound came, one of its shadows had already been found on a table in Buckinghamshire.